about that. Other countries may grow stronger. Big, populous countries may grow richer. And as they do so, they may start to embrace more fully our values of democracy and liberty. But even if they do not, our interests will remain. Our values will endure. And the need to defend them and project them will be as important as ever. So we, our two countries together, have a responsibility to lead. Because when others step up as we step back, it is bad for America, for Britain, and the world. It is in our interests, those of Britain and America together, to stand strong together to defend our values, our interests, and the very ideas in which we believe. This cannot mean a return to the failed policies of the past. The days of Britain and America intervening in sovereign countries in an attempt to remake the world in our own image are over. But nor can we afford to stand idly by when the threat is real and when it is in our own interests to intervene. We must be strong, smart, and hard-headed, and we must demonstrate the resolve necessary to stand up for our interests. And whether it is the security of Israel in the Middle East or the Baltic states in Eastern Europe, we must always stand up for our friends and allies in democratic countries that find themselves in tough neighbourhoods too. We each have different political traditions. We will sometimes pursue different domestic policies, and there may be occasions on which we disagree. But the common values and interests that bring us together are hugely powerful. And as your foremost friend and ally, we support many of the priorities your government has laid out for America's engagement with the world. It is why I join you in your determination to take on and defeat Daesh and the ideology of Islamist extremism that inspires them and many other terrorist groups in the world today. It is in both our national interests to do so. This will require us to use the intelligence provided by the finest security agencies in the world, and it will require the use of military might. But it also demands a wider effort, because one of the lessons of fighting terrorism in the last 15 years or so is, yes, killing terrorists can save innocent lives. But until we kill the idea that drives them, the ideology, we will always have to live with this threat. And as they are defeated on the ground, the terrorists are exploiting the internet and social media to spread this ideology that is preying on vulnerable citizens in our own countries, inspiring them to commit acts of terror in our own cities. That is why the UK has led the world in developing a strategy for preventing violent extremism, and why the British and American governments are working together to take on and defeat the ideology of Islamist extremism. I look forward to working with the President and his administration to step up our efforts still further in order to defeat this evil ideology. But of course, we should always be careful to distinguish between this extreme and hateful ideology and the peaceful religion of Islam and the hundreds of millions of its adherents, including millions of our own citizens, and those further afield, who are so often the first victims of this ideology's terror. And nor is it enough merely to focus on violent extremism. We need to address the whole spectrum of extremism, starting with the bigotry and hatred that can so often turn to violence. Yet ultimately, to defeat Daesh, we must employ all of the diplomatic means at our disposal. That means working internationally to secure a political solution in Syria, and challenging the alliance between the Syrian regime and its backers in Tehran. When it comes to Russia, as so often, it is wise to turn to the example of President Reagan, who during his negotiations with his opposite number, Mikhail Gorbachev, used to abide by the adage, trust but verify. With President Putin, my advice is to engage but beware. There is nothing inevitable about conflict between Russia and the West, and nothing unavoidable about retreating to the days of the Cold War. But we should engage with Russia from a position of strength, and we should build the relationships, systems and processes that make cooperation more likely than conflict. And that, particularly after the illegal annexation of Crimea, give assurance to Russia's neighbouring states that their security is not in question. We should not jeopardise the freedoms that President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher brought to Eastern Europe by accepting President Putin's claim that it is now in his sphere of influence. And progress on this issue would also help to secure another of this nation's priorities, to reduce Iran's malign influence in the Middle East. This is a priority for the UK too, as we support our allies in the Gulf states to push back against Iran's aggressive efforts to build an arc of influence from Tehran through to the Mediterranean. The nuclear deal with Iran was controversial, but it has neutralised the possibility of the Iranians acquiring nuclear weapons for more than a decade. It has seen Iran remove 13,000 centrifuges, together with associated infrastructure, and eliminate its stock of 20% enriched uranium. That was vitally important for regional security, but the agreement must now be very carefully and rigorously policed, and any breaches should be dealt with firmly and immediately. To deal with the threats of the modern world, we need to rebuild confidence in the institutions upon which we all rely. In part, that means multinational institutions, because we know that so many of the threats we face today, global terrorism, climate change, organised crime, unprecedented mass movements of people, do not respect national borders. So we must turn towards those multinational institutions like the UN and NATO that encourage international cooperation and partnership. But those multinational institutions need to work for the countries that formed them and to serve the needs and interests of the people of those nations. They have no democratic mandate of their own. So I share your reform agenda and believe that by working together, we can make those institutions more relevant and purposeful than they are today. I call on others, therefore, to join us in that effort and to ensure they step up and contribute as they should. That's why I have encouraged Antonio Guterres, the new UN Secretary-General, to pursue an ambitious reform programme, focusing the United Nations on its core functions of peacekeeping, conflict prevention and resolution. And it's why I've already raised with my fellow European leaders the need to deliver on their commitments to spend 2% of their GDP on defence and 20% of their defence budgets on equipment. It's also why I have already raised with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO, the need to make sure the alliance is as equipped to fight terrorism and cyber warfare as it is to fight more conventional forms of war. America's leadership in NATO, supported by Britain, must be the central element around which the alliance is built. But alongside this continued commitment, I'm also clear that EU nations must similarly step up to ensure this institution that provides the cornerstone of the West's defence continues to be as effective as it can be. Yet the most important institution is and should always be the nation-state. Strong nations form strong institutions, and they form the basis of the international partnerships and cooperation that bring stability to our world. Nations, accountable to their populations, deriving, as the Declaration of Independence puts it, their just powers from the consent of the governed, can choose to join international organisations or not. They can choose to cooperate with others or not, choose to trade with others or not. Which is why, if the countries of the European Union wish to integrate further, my view is that they should be free to do so, because that is what they choose. But Britain, as a sovereign nation, with the same values but a different political and cultural history, has chosen to take a different path, because our history and culture is profoundly internationalist. We are a European country and proud of our shared European heritage, but we are also a country that has always looked beyond Europe to the wider world. We have ties of family, kinship and history to countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and countries across Africa, the Pacific and Caribbean. And of course, we have ties of kinship, language and culture to these United States too. As Churchill put it, we speak the same language, kneel at the same altars, and to a very large extent pursue the same ideals. And today, increasingly, we have strong economic, commercial, defence and political relationships as well. So I'm delighted that the new administration has made a trade agreement between our countries one of its earliest priorities. A new trade deal between Britain and America must work for both sides and serve both of our national interests. It must help to grow our respective economies and to provide the high-skilled, high-paid jobs of the future for working people across America and across the UK. And it must work for those who have too often felt left behind by the forces of globalisation. People, often those on modest incomes, living in relatively rich countries like our own, who feel that the global system of free markets and free trade is simply not working for them in its current form. Such a deal, allied to the reforms we are making to our own economy to ensure wealth and opportunity is spread across our land, can demonstrate to those who feel locked out and left behind that free markets, free economies and free trade can deliver the brighter future they need. And it can maintain, indeed it can build, support for the rules-based international system on which the stability of our world continues to rely. The UK is already America's fifth largest export destination, while your markets account for almost a fifth of global exports from our shores. Exports to the UK from this state of Pennsylvania alone account for more than $2 billion a year. The UK is the largest... Somebody from Pennsylvania. The UK is the largest market in the EU and the third largest market in the world for exporters here. America is the largest single destination for UK outward investment and the single largest investor in the UK. And your companies are investing or expanding in the UK at the rate of more than 10 projects a week. British companies employ people in every US state from Texas to Vermont, and the UK-US defence relationship is the broadest, deepest and most advanced of any two countries, sharing military hardware and expertise. And of course, we have recently invested in the new F-35 strike aircraft for our new aircraft carriers that will secure our naval presence and increase our ability to project our power around the world for years to come. Because of these strong economic and commercial links and our shared history and the strength of our relationship, I look forward to pursuing talks with President Trump and his new administration about a new UK-US free trade agreement in the coming months. It will take detailed work, but we welcome your openness to these discussions and hope we can make progress so that the new global Britain that emerges after Brexit is even better equipped to take its place confidently in the world. Such an agreement would see us taking that next step in the special relationship that exists between us, cementing and affirming one of the greatest forces for progress this world has ever known. 70 years ago, in 1946, Churchill proposed a new phase in this relationship, to win a Cold War that many had not even realized had started. He described how an iron curtain had fallen from the Baltic to the Adriatic, covering all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Sofia, and Bucharest. Today, those great cities, homes of great culture and heritage, live in freedom and peace. And they do so because of the leadership of Britain and America, and of Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan. They do so ultimately because our ideas will always prevail. And they do so because when the world demands leadership, it is this alliance of values and interests, this special relationship between two countries, that is, to borrow the words of another great American statesman, enters the arena with our faces marred by dust and sweat and blood, to strive valiantly and know the triumph of high achievement. As we renew the promise of our nations to make them stronger at home, in the words of President Reagan, as the sleeping giant stirs, so let us renew the relationship that can lead the world towards the promise of freedom and prosperity marked out in parchment by those ordinary citizens 240 years ago, so that we may not be counted with the cold and timid souls who know neither victory or defeat, but with those who strive to do the deeds that will lead us to a better world. That better future is within reach. Together, we can build it. Thank you.
Prime Minister Theresa May taking applause at a gathering of senior Republicans in Philadelphia. She's speaking on the same stage where earlier Donald Trump spoke, and across this hour of Outside Source we'll look back over that major speech by Prime Minister May and also by all of the developments relating to the Trump presidency. Theresa May in some detail sketched out a vision not just of the UK as a strong nation state and an internationalist state, but also of the evolution of what she called the special relationship between the US and the UK. Earlier, I should tell you that Donald Trump talked about the work that he's doing, along with the work that Republicans are doing, as being blessed by divinity. We'll go through some of the latest developments in the hour. But